She returned after 5 years to a house frozen in time, only to realize some love stories fade in silence. A poignant tale of memory, loss, and the first snowfall. The first snowfall of the year arrived earlier than expected, covering the streets of Seoul in a quiet, white stillness. Street lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting a soft glow on the familiar path ahead. Wrapped in a thick wool coat, I stood before the estate that once felt like home. Time had dulled the edges of my memories, but stepping through the iron gates, the past returned with clarity. 5 years had passed since I last stood here. When I left, I had hoped distance would erase the pain, that time would make me forget. Yet here I was again, drawn back by circumstances beyond my control. The house loomed large and quiet, no longer filled with warmth. I hesitated before stepping inside, my heart heavy with the weight of the past. The scent of aged wood and faint traces of jasmine lingered in the air. My fingers brushed the stair railing, remembering how often I had run up and down those steps, laughter echoing behind me. Everything looked the same, but it felt different, like a life I had once lived but no longer belonged to. Framed photographs lined the hallway, each one a reminder of what had changed. Among them were pictures of him with someone else, a woman who now stood beside him in moments that should have been mine. She smiled in the photos, her hand resting easily on his arm, her presence replacing everything I had left behind. I forced myself to keep walking, swallowing the emotions threatening to surface. He had moved on. I had told myself I was ready for that reality, but standing here, it was harder than I had imagined. My old room remained untouched. The books on the shelves, the curtains, even the way the bedspread was folded, all as if frozen in time. But I knew better. Time had moved on, even if the room had not. I ran my fingers over the edge of the desk, remembering late nights spent writing letters I never sent, words filled with feelings I couldn't express. 5 years ago, leaving had felt like the only choice. The love I had for him had been overwhelming, consuming, and impossible to hold on to without losing myself in the process. I had walked away believing it was the only way to breathe again. But distance had not erased the feelings, only buried them beneath layers of time. A gust of wind rattled the window, pulling me from my thoughts. I left the room and made my way outside, drawn toward the garden, the place where so much had begun and ended. Back then, the garden had been filled with color. Cherry blossoms drifted through the air, petals catching in my hair. He had watched as I tried to gather them in my hands, a quiet observer of my futile efforts. It had taken me years to understand what he meant when he told me that some things could not be held onto, no matter how tightly grasped. Now, winter had turned the garden into something unrecognizable. The once vibrant flowers lay hidden beneath frost, the trees standing bare against the gray sky. I exhaled, my breath visible in the cold air, a reminder that time had reshaped everything, even the places I once thought unchangeable. The silence was interrupted by a presence I had known so well that I did not need to turn around to confirm it. Even after all this time, I recognized the feeling of being watched, of being near him. My hands clenched at my sides, my pulse quickening despite my resolve to remain unaffected. But I could not bring myself to turn. Some things were easier left unseen. Snowflakes settled in my hair as I took a slow breath. I had come here for closure, to convince myself that the past no longer had a hold on me. But standing in the place where so many memories lingered, I realized that letting go was not as simple as I had imagined. Still, I could not stay. I had left once before, believing it was the only way to move forward. That had not changed. Without looking back, I stepped away from the garden, leaving behind everything that had once been. The past would remain here, etched into the quiet spaces and winter air. Some love stories did not end with a conclusion, but faded into the spaces between then and now, never truly gone, but never fully present either. As I walked away, I realized that the scent of forgotten vows still lingered, faint but persistent, refusing to be erased by time. Snow continued to fall as I reached the edge of the property. The air was colder here, the wind sharper against my face. Beyond the walls of the estate, the city pulsed faintly with life, unaware, uncaring of the sorrow I carried within. The sharp contrast between the warm memories that once filled my heart and the frozen silence of now made the distance between past and present feel insurmountable. I walked the streets slowly, my boots crunching against the thin layer of ice beneath the snow. Every step away from that house felt like peeling away another layer of something I had once loved. The city had changed in my absence, but so had I. The lights were brighter, the noise louder, and I was quieter. I had spent the last 5 years building walls that would not crumble, convincing myself that I had outgrown the shadows of what I left behind. But it wasn't true. The shadows still followed. In a quiet corner of the city, I found myself standing before a familiar storefront, a modest bookshop with a small wooden sign that swayed gently in the wind. The windows were fogged from within, golden light spilling through the glass panes. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The warmth greeted me like an old friend. The scent of paper and ink filled the air, mingled with the faintest trace of roasted coffee from a small counter near the back. Shelves towered around me, overflowing with stories waiting to be discovered. I wandered aimlessly, my fingers brushing the spines of books I had once read in this very place. It had been our sanctuary, a shared space where the world outside ceased to matter, a place where silence wasn't empty but full of unspoken understanding. I reached the back of the store, where the windows looked out onto the alleyway beyond. There, tucked into a small nook, was the table where we used to sit. The table was empty now, but in my mind, I could still see him there, head bent over a book, a soft smile playing on his lips whenever I entered. That image returned with such clarity it stole the breath from my lungs. Time slipped away as I stood there. The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, but I remained rooted in place, caught between then and now. When I finally stepped outside again, the snow had thickened, blanketing the streets in white. I wandered aimlessly, the cold no longer stinging, lost in the gravity of memories too long ignored. A bridge came into view ahead, one that curved gracefully over the narrow river that split the district in two. I approached slowly, each step echoing louder than the last. The river below glistened under the streetlights, its surface partially frozen, reflecting the amber glow of the world above. I gripped the railing tightly, letting the cold seep into my skin. This was where we had first met, where winter had begun not just in season, but in everything that would follow. I had been so different then, guarded but hopeful, broken but still willing to reach for something more. He had seen that in me, and in his quiet way, he had held space for all that I carried. He never asked for more than I could give, and yet I gave him everything without realizing it. And when I walked away, I left behind not only him but pieces of myself I had yet to reclaim. The wind picked up, howling softly through the rails of the bridge. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to remember not just the joy, but the pain, the fear, and the moments I had tried to bury. Each memory rose and fell like the tide, relentless and inevitable. I opened my eyes only when the cold became too much to bear. It was late. The city had quieted, the streets now nearly empty. I turned from the bridge and began to walk again, this time not to escape but to face what awaited next. This visit had never been about reclaiming something lost. It was about confronting the spaces where love had once lived, acknowledging that not all stories were meant to be completed. Some remained unfinished by design, their beauty found not in resolution, but in the echoes they left behind. And so, with the snow still falling and the sky cloaked in a velvet gray, I disappeared into the night, carrying with me the weight of memory, the ache of what could have been, and the quiet, enduring truth that some things are meant to be remembered, not relived. The following morning brought a pale, wintry light that filtered through the curtains of the modest hotel room. I lay still, listening to the hum of the heater, the distant muffled sounds of the city waking slowly beneath the weight of fresh snow. Despite the quiet, sleep had not come easily. Memories had drifted through my mind like the snowfall outside, soft, slow, and relentless. It had been a mistake to think I had come here only to find closure. What I had really been chasing was a thread, thin and frayed, that connected me to the version of myself I had abandoned 5 years ago. That self had been full of longing, held together by love and fear in equal measure. I had believed leaving would preserve something of myself. But the truth was, distance did not grant freedom. It only created silence wide enough for regret to echo within. I rose and dressed with mechanical care, layering wool over cotton, boots over socks, and gloves over shaking fingers. Outside, the streets shimmered with the remains of the snowfall, already being trampled by the footsteps of those with places to be. I had nowhere to go, and yet I walked anyway. My feet led me without direction, drawn by the need to revisit the forgotten corners of our past. The city had not waited for me. Stores had changed hands, buildings had been renovated, and familiar alleyways now led to unfamiliar ends. But every now and then, something remained untouched. The remnants of a life I had once known lingered in the most unlikely of places. At a small intersection near the university, I paused. There, beneath a street lamp, stood the old tree where he and I had often waited for the bus. Its limbs were bare now, thin branches reaching out like a memory grasping to be remembered. I stepped closer, brushing gloved fingers against the bark. Time had carved into it faint markings, initials from strangers perhaps, or from those who, like me, once believed in the permanence of certain moments. But nothing was permanent. Not love, not time, not even the promises made under a winter sky. Continuing down the hill, I reached the library. Its stone steps were dusted in snow, its tall windows opaque with condensation. I lingered outside, watching students come and go, their lives untouched by the sorrow I carried. This place had been sacred once. Inside those walls, we had shared so many books, thoughts, and fleeting glances that said more than words ever could. Now, it was just another building in a city that no longer belonged to me. I turned away before the weight became too much. The wind had grown sharper. My pace quickened not out of purpose but necessity, as if moving faster might keep the past from catching up. By afternoon, the sky had darkened again, snow threatening once more. I found myself in the heart of a park I hadn't meant to visit. The frozen lake stretched before me, its surface a brittle sheet of silver reflecting the clouds. A few scattered benches lined the edge, and I sat on the one nearest the tall willow tree. Here, years ago, we had once watched ducks glide across the water, our silence comfortable, the kind that comes only with closeness built over years. But even closeness had its limits. I had learned that too late. As the cold seeped into my bones, I thought about the woman in the photographs, the one who now shared the moments I once thought were mine to keep. There had been no bitterness in her smile, just warmth. She had filled a space I left behind, and perhaps she had done so with a kind of love that didn't waver the way mine had. I had never hated her. I couldn't. What she had taken only because I had let go. I had given up something I didn't know how to hold, and she had picked up the pieces and built something beautiful. I rose from the bench and walked again. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long over the snow-covered ground. Each step took me farther from the estate, yet somehow closer to something I had refused to name. Not closure, not forgiveness. Something quieter, harder, a reckoning. At dusk, I arrived at the small chapel on the edge of town. Its steeple rose into the darkening sky, the snow gathering along its roof. I had not meant to come here, but something in me had pulled me toward it. It had been the place of my last goodbye, though no one else had known. He had been inside, speaking with the priest, and I had stood in the back, hidden among shadows. I had not spoken. I had not stayed. I had only watched him one final time, unable to say the words that had burned in my chest. Now the chapel stood empty, its doors unlocked, the silence inside complete. I entered slowly, my footsteps soft against the stone floor. Candles flickered near the altar, their flames swaying slightly in the draft. I sat in the back pew, the cold from the wooden bench seeping through my coat. I didn't pray. I hadn't come for faith. I had come for remembrance. For a long while, I sat there. Outside, the storm began again, snow falling steadily against the stained glass windows. I closed my eyes, not to forget, but to remember differently. To see our story not as a loss, but as something that had simply run its course. When I opened them again, the candles still burned, their flames unwavering. I stood and left without a sound, the heavy doors closing behind me. Back at the hotel, I packed my things. There wasn't much. I had never intended to stay long. The suitcase closed with a finality I hadn't expected. I stood for a moment, surveying the room, committing to memory the soft light, the shadowed corners, the way the snow continued to fall just outside the window. I knew I wouldn't return. Not to this room. Not to this city. Perhaps not even to the idea of what I had once longed for. The morning of my departure was still and pale, the sky washed in silver. The taxi arrived promptly, its headlights cutting through the haze. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk and settled into the back seat. As we drove away, the city passed in quiet glimpses of parks, storefronts, alleyways, and the bridge. All of them carried something of him. And all of them now carried something of me, too. At the train station, I waited on the platform as the engine approached in the distance. Around me, travelers moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable, their destinations unknown. I stood still, the snow falling more softly now, as if even the storm had grown tired. When the train arrived, I boarded without hesitation, finding my seat by the window. As the city receded behind me, I pressed my forehead lightly against the cold glass and allowed myself to grieve not just for what had been lost, but for what had never had the chance to become. Time did not erase all things. Some remained, etched deeply into the places we once stood, the words we never said, the glances we shared before the world changed. But time offered distance, and in that distance, a kind of peace. I would carry the memory of him not as a wound, but as a part of the journey I had lived. A part that had shaped me, taught me the sharp edges of love, and the soft places where it settles when the storm passes. The snow continued to fall beyond the window, blanketing the fields in white. A quiet promise that even the coldest season must eventually give way to spring. And somewhere beneath that snow, the cherry blossoms waited, not forgotten, only resting.